On behalf of the Friends of the Concord Free Public Library, I would like to welcome you to the Ruth Ratner Miller Award for Excellence in American History, where we will honor the 2009 recipient of the award, David Herbert Donald. This award was offered to the Concord Library in 2001 by Concord resident Richard Miller to honor the legacy of his mother, a founding member of the Holocaust Commission and Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., who believed that history was not merely desirable, but a civic and religious duty. Before we begin the program, I have just a little bit of housekeeping I need to do. First of all, I'd like to introduce you to the new director of the Concord Free Public Library, Carrie Cronin. Carrie? And if you have a chance at the reception, please say hello to her. She's very friendly. Now I would like to introduce our three guest speakers who will share their experiences with David Herbert Donald as a scholar, teacher, and collaborator. John Stouffer is chair of the History of American Civilization and professor of English, African, and African American Studies at Harvard University, as well as a leading scholar of the Civil War era and social protest movements, especially anti-slavery. Nina Silber is a professor of history at Boston University. Her writing has focused on gender and women during the Civil War. She has been a distinguished lecturer at Pennsylvania State and Charles University in Prague. Bernard Balin is Adams University professor and James Duncan Phillips Professor of Early American History, Emeritus at Harvard University, and a two-time recipient of the Pulitzer Prize, as well as recipient of the National Book Award and Bancroft Prize. Each one of the speakers is going to come up one at a time, and we're going to begin with John Stouffer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be here today. I should say at the outset that I did not know David Donald well. I met him personally. I met him 3 times personally. I had some email correspondence with him. But I read all of his work and read it deeply, and having read his work, I felt like I knew him very well, and I want to share with you why I feel like I know him very well. Most of you in this room would agree with me when I say that Professor Donald was one of the preeminent scholars in any field of the humanities in the 20th century. In my view, his greatest accomplishment was as a biographer. He won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for biography. He should have won 3 Pulitzer Prizes. Most of you would agree with that, and I want to give you a sense of why I think that is. In many respects, all scholarship can be seen as a form of intellectual autobiography, and it's well known among biographers and among studies of biography. There's a kind of cliche that says biographers reveal as much about themselves as they do about their subjects. And I think with Professor Donald that is true in the best sense. The first book of Donald's that I read was Charles Sumner and the Coming of the Civil War. It was actually right before I entered the PhD program at Yale, in which I worked with David and Brian Davis. I knew that I was interested in abolitionism. I began reading that book at about 9:30 one evening, and I kept reading it at midnight. I kept reading it at 2 a.m. I was so engrossed that I did not finish that book until about 9 the next morning. Went through, I think, a pot of coffee. But it was one of those magical reading experiences for me in which I lost sense of time, I lost sense of place, I entered a world, I entered a new dimension. And that's one indication of a reflection of Donald's greatness as a biographer. I also want, as a way to emphasize Professor Donald as a biographer, provide a context. David Donald was born and bred in the South. if you didn't know who he was, had you met him even at the end of his life, one of the first things you would know about him is that he was a Southerner because of the way he spoke. Despite living in Boston for decades, he still spoke with a fairly pronounced Southern accent. And Donald grew up in the South, in which Southerners defined themselves. The vast majority of Southerners at the time in which Professor Donald was born and bred defined themselves first as Southerners, second as Americans. It was a period in which virtually all Southern writers, when they looked to the North and when they wrote about abolitionists, they wrote about them with nothing but scorn. Southern writers also had immense influence at the time in which Professor Donald was writing on the Civil War era. Let me give you 3 examples, and the examples I give are of writers who I have the utmost respect for, also people who I think are among the great writers in the humanities in the 20th century. And the comparative examples are C. Vann Woodward, Robert Penn Warren, and David Potter, all giants in their field. All of them wrote extensively about the Civil War era. All of them wrote in varying degrees, used biography as a method. Robert Penn Warren, his first book was a biography of John Brown. It's, in many respects, a dazzlingly good book. But the easiest, it was first published in 1930, has been recently reissued. The easiest way to describe this book on John Brown, the fiery abolitionist of the North, is that Warren's John Brown is like Milton's Satan. Someone so demonic, he becomes this fascinating figure. It was immensely influential for C. Vann Woodward, who has to this day a very influential essay on John Brown's Private War, in fact, in which he casts John Brown as analogous to, or he actually says that essentially that he's a communist. For men born and bred in the South of this generation, C. Vann Woodward, Robert Penn Warren, David Potter to a certain degree, about the only thing worse than abolitionists, John Brown being the epitome of abolitionists, Charles Sumner not far behind. The only thing worse than abolitionists and Northern reformers, including Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, were communists and militant blacks, particularly black nationalists. One anecdote, if you go to Robert Penn Warren's writings, there's a letter, I think it's from Cleanth Brooks, another Southerner who was a close friend of Robert Penn Warren, describes a scene, this is in, I think, the 50s, in which Rosanna Warren, Robert Penn Warren's daughter, is practicing on the piano, and she starts in on the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which we heard tonight. And Cleanth Brooks and Robert Penn Warren are shocked and essentially ask her to quit. My point is that for men born in the South of a certain era, the power of place was profound. The power of place both shaped and inspired their work. I think Penn Warren, C. Vann Woodward, David Potter are among the giants in their field, brilliant all in their own right. And that brings me to Charles Sumner, a Southerner who chooses to write on figures who are considered to be great villains of his society, particularly Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner, in the pantheon of rogues for Southerners of his generation, Sumner was not far behind John Brown. Both were seen as imperialists. Both were seen as aggressive Northerners who wanted to strip the South of its society, of its identity, and to deny it of the organic communal agrarianism that they embraced. And indeed, if you read Professor Donald's historical essays on abolitionists, you see something of the criticism, not nearly as profound, that Penn Warren and C. Vann Woodward and David Potter and a host of others who are from the South bring to it. And had someone not known David Donald, only known that he was a Southerner born in 1920, and said that he was going to write a biography of Charles Sumner, you would place your bets on the fact that it would be a very critical biography. And one of the brilliances of this book is that Donald, as a biographer, lets his art transcend his identity as a Southerner. He empathizes with his figure, with Sumner. He seeks to understand Sumner in his world. He gets into Charles Sumner's head in a way that breathes life into Charles Sumner, into Boston, into Washington, in ways that greatly enrich our understanding of the man, of the time, of the era, of the Civil War. Granted, there are a few moments, but no more than a page, in which the writer will step back and judge and critique. He's sympathetic, but critical. But almost the entire 600 pages, you have this past in all of its rich texture brought to life, resurrected. And it remains, both volumes remain, the standard works of Charles Sumner. He had an easier time with Abraham Lincoln. But when Donald began writing on Lincoln and Herndon, he wrote at a time in which Herndon and Lincoln were seen, in a sense, as villains. And so one of his great, great tributes as a writer, as a biographer, was the capacity for empathy, was the capacity for generosity to his subjects, to his time, was the desire not so much to critique and to pass judgment on a time, but to understand the person and the era in all of its rich complexity, in all of its contradiction, in all of its ambiguity and paradox. And the result is this, to use Henry James's term and Forster's term, a rounded figure, a figure that's filled with life rather than a pasteboard mask, so to speak. And he brings that to his work. And it leads me to Professor Donald as an individual. The thing that comes through his biographies and his writing most of all is this sense of great humanism, this sense of him treating all individuals as equal. It's as though Professor Donald had internalized the scriptural creed that God is no respecter of persons, that in God's eyes all humans are equal. He applies that as a writer to all of his subjects. And as a result, you have this extraordinary, as I said, generosity and empathy. And I've gotten to know a number of the students who have worked with Professor Donald. Michael Vorenberg is in the audience in the back, who's following in the footsteps of Donald as one of the preeminent scholars of his day. Catherine Clinton. Bob Lamb is a friend of mine when I was at Purdue University receiving a master's degree. And one of the things that they all said of Professor Donald is his generosity and empathy, not only at the level of the intellectual generosity, but emotional, spiritual, psychological generosity. And when I heard that, I essentially nodded my head, because that was the Professor Donald that I read, that I know as a writer. Thank you.
I'm going to echo a number of themes that John Stauffer talked about, generosity, empathy. I'm also going to echo the theme that I only met Professor Donald on 2 occasions, but those 2 occasions did make me wish that I had met him on more occasions. I found him to be wonderfully generous, engaging, gracious. When I told my husband that I'd been asked to speak at this event in honor of Professor Donald, he instantly recalled the warm and extended conversation that they had had about Thomas Wolfe, the subject of another of Professor Donald's biographies, and my husband was particularly impressed with the way Professor Donald had captured the close and empathetic relationship that existed between Wolfe and his editor,
And in the interest of full disclosure, I should say that editor was also my husband's great uncle, Maxwell Perkins. So he was very interested in that relationship. Even more, my husband, who I'll confess has a bit of academophobia. No, I don't actually think that's a word, but maybe it should actually be a word. He was so won over by Professor Donald's manner that he was almost ready to join the ranks of David Donald's graduate students. And I think, in fact, that empathy, as it informed the relationship between Thomas Wolfe and Maxwell Perkins, as it was reflected in David Donald's own personal manner, and as it was woven into nearly all of his biographical portraits, really probably is the underlying theme here. And it was the thing that allowed Professor Donald to master and to excel at what he did so well, which was to write these superb biographies. A sense of human nature, of human failings, human capabilities, a keen sense of how human beings make their way in the world, all of that pervades Professor Donald's scholarship. And I suppose I appreciate this the most, given my own learning, my frame of reference, in Professor Donald's work on Abraham Lincoln. And like many people, I'm sure, like many people here, I think once I had read Professor Donald's Lincoln, I'd never think of the 16th president in the same way again. Now, lately, I've gained a new appreciation for David Donald's Lincoln because I've been spending quite a bit of time reading Lincoln lore from the 1930s. Now, honestly, I think the recent hype that we had about comparing Obama and Lincoln, all of that would pale in comparison to what went on in the 1930s when old Abe was refashioned as an icon of FDR's New Deal. The 1930s, after all, and I'm sure David Donald knew this himself, the 1930s, after all, was a decade that gave us Carl Sandburg's Lincoln, not to mention Raymond Massey's and Henry Fonda's Lincoln. If you remember, these are the films, believe me, I remember them, I just saw them, but these are the films, these are the novels, these are the historical works where we see Lincoln as a young man in love with Anne Rutledge and then heartbroken by her death, where Lincoln is an idealistic lawyer who claims he doesn't really know the law, but he does know what's wrong and what's right, or where Lincoln appears as a man without keen political ambitions, because Mary has more than enough ambition for both of them, just a desire to speak for the people. In fact, after immersing myself in this 1930s version of Lincoln, I've become convinced that if the Lincoln Memorial had been constructed in the 1930s instead of the 1920s, it would not have depicted the magisterial Lincoln who sits surrounded by his resounding words, but a young Abe, probably bearing some resemblance to Henry Fonda, sighing over Anne Rutledge's grave. Anyway, I'm telling you all this because just as I found myself up to my eyeballs in this goopy, sentimental Lincoln, I was also rereading David Donald's Lincoln because I had assigned it in my undergraduate Civil War class, and thank goodness for that. Now, perhaps it's unfair to compare Professor Donald's work with those from the 1930s, but I do think that to some extent that goopy sentimentalism of Sandburg or Robert Sherwood can be detected in so many of the Lincoln biographies that came later. In contrast, David Donald's Lincoln is clean and straightforward, not soaring as a symbol above the historical fray, but deeply enmeshed in his historical circumstances. And that is as it should be because David Donald knew his history. He's caught up in the often ugly wrangling of antebellum politics, and Lincoln, as Donald observes, could sometimes be a demagogue, especially in his early speech-making. Frequently, Lincoln could be an ambitious, even grasping politician who found ways to privately and quietly advance his career. Yet, as a biographer, David Donald also never forgot the human side of Lincoln, and he persistently reminded us of the way Lincoln embodied thoroughly recognizable and human qualities that defined his limitations and his capacity for greatness. Thus, it seems perfectly plausible. Indeed, I think for me, it's now hard to imagine the 16th president in any other way, that Lincoln had imbibed this kind of passive quality. That's the hallmark that I think David Donald brings to this, a kind of passive quality from his hardscrabble upbringing, from his religious background, perhaps from his family circumstances, that could make him feel as if he could not control his circumstances, but would be controlled by them. That passivity could certainly hinder Lincoln, but it could perhaps even more remarkably give him the strength to manage his often trying circumstances with considerable thought and reflection. Indeed, in the end, I found David Donald's story of Abraham Lincoln far more moving than the gushy stories of the 1930s, precisely because Lincoln achieved so much in spite of the limitations that loomed so large. A friend of mine confessed the other day that when he finished David Donald's account, despite knowing full well what the ending would be, he cried. In short, David Donald wrote great, incisive, inspiring biographies because he had a wonderful grasp on the human spirit and human psychology, as well as an impeccable feel for history. And I am honored to be able to pay him this tribute tonight. Thank you.
Well, I'm also very pleased to be here to have an occasion to say a few words about David Donald, whom, as opposed to our previous speakers, I knew very well. We were close colleagues for 18 years. I thought when I received this invitation to say a few words this evening, I thought I would say something about the substance of his wonderful writing. But many of you are very familiar with it, I know, and Professor Stauffer and Professor Silber are great experts on the subject of his writing, and it didn't seem to me to be necessary. So I thought I would say a few words about him in a much more personal way. And comment as it comes through this on some of his scholarship. He was, of course, a superb scholar and a great historian. The one thing I would add to what Professor Stauffer was saying, and Professor Silber, by the way, just in passing, was that his great works are biographies. And I think it's possible to say that a biographical form is limiting. That is, you're constructed already in the life of the person. But what struck me so much about his biographies is that he wasn't confined. And in fact, they're very broad histories that draw out the great substance of the world around these people and the effect they had on it. So while one can read these as narrow biographies, in fact, they are superb histories as well. But it isn't the substance of his scholarship that I want to talk about, but rather more personally about him. And if I refer to him as David, it's because it's natural. As I say, we were colleagues for 18 years. And let me put it this way. He joined the Harvard History Department in 1973. And I remember the circumstances particularly well because I was chairman of the history department at the time. The history department in 1972, one of my colleagues is here and may recall that, in 1972, the history department, of course, unanimously voted to invite him to Harvard. He was at Johns Hopkins at the time. And as chairman, it was my obligation to see to it that, if possible, we could get him to come to Harvard. Well, there was nothing obvious about this. He was a commanding figure in Johns Hopkins, very successful, a great figure in the university and that wonderful department of history at Johns Hopkins, and there was no compelling reason for him to leave. Furthermore, he was, of course, a Southerner, and while Maryland is not exactly the deep South, it's at least the border South, and it's closer to him, possibly, than New England. But we did issue the usual invitation, and it went through all the governing boards in the usual way without, of course, any problem whatever. But there was no action from Baltimore. And things seemed to be held up. And as chairman, it was my job to see to it that something was done about this, and if we could get David Donald to agree to come to Harvard. My negotiating skills are not very strong, And my only resource was the dean of the faculty. And the dean of the faculty was John Dunlop at the time. Some of you may know something about Dunlop. He was one of the great labor arbitrators and negotiators in American history. And he had been negotiating with the great labor unions and the great industrial leaders for years. In fact, he became Secretary of Labor under President Ford. And Dunlop, a very tough character indeed, and a very smart man, I went to Dunlop and I said, look, we're having trouble. There's no reason for David Donald to leave Johns Hopkins. What do we do? So Dunlop said, well, look, I have to go to Washington next week, and I'll stop by in Baltimore and stop by at the Donalds and talk to them. And he did. And when he came back, I saw him. I said, John, what happened? And I wouldn't say it's exaggerating to say that he was in shock, but he was terribly impressed. And what negotiation took place in Baltimore, I have no idea. But in any case, at that point, things looked a little better. And in 1973, David Donald joined the department, and he remained in the department until his retirement in 1991. It was 18 years, and as colleagues of the department, of course, we saw each other a great deal. And I thought I would say just a word about my sense of him as a person in the department, and also in another context as a collaborator in a writing project, because it is the way in which I got to know him best. Now, well, those of you who are not academics should know that departments do two things, really. They provide an area of instruction in a given field. They take responsibility for conveying knowledge and instructing students at different levels. And second, they reproduce themselves. That is to say, they make appointments. And that is not a technical matter. That is the definition of the future. It's important, because it is very important, because the future of that field and that institution is determined by these appointments. And in all of this, David Donald took a very strong role. He had very clear views of what the future should be in the history field that he commanded, and he was a superb teacher. There was never a question from the day he got to Harvard that those lectures, undergraduate lectures, would be enormous successes, and they were. They were compelling and clear and crisp and very intelligent as he probed into this complex area of Civil War history and the surrounding eras. A very complex subject indeed, and his lecturing on it was superb. Everyone knew this. And his command of graduate education was equally successful. Many graduate students came to him. They were instructed closely by him and picked up some of his genius in working out historical depictions, and they never forgot the training that they got from him. He was very successful. In the second part of the department's work in appointments, he also had very clear opinions, many opinions about what the future would be, and he was not always successful in this for the following reason. A tenured faculty, you should understand, or at least I believe, is a kind of priesthood. No matter how never mind how you got there. Once you get there, it's a kind of priesthood, and priests know the truth, and they know the absolute truth. And everyone in that department knew the absolute truth, even though it wasn't the same truth all the time. And David, of course, knew the truth because he was very smart. He knew the truth better than most people, especially me. And consequently, over the years, 18 of them, there was a great deal of back and forth on these questions of appointments and indeed of curricular matters as well. I'll only say this about it. I cannot now, I was thinking about this today, we struggled over many things, and I swear to you, I cannot remember what on earth we were struggling about. But these were gruesome controversies in which, as I say, this priesthood became especially complex. But I remember the style, not the contents of these controversies, but I remember the style within the department. There would be a rambling discussion about something or other, a person, a subject, or a piece of the curriculum, something would be going on. It'd be rambling all over the place, and people say this and people say that. And then at a certain point, David would sort of clear his throat, and he would say, I'll never forget this phrase of his, is Aida here? Aida, I hope I get this right. He would say, let's see. When he said this, if I were in opposition to him, I knew I was cooked. Because he had had time to mobilize his thoughts. He was extremely logical and persuasive, and I knew if I agreed with him, I could relax because we'd won the thing. And if I disagreed with him, I was toast. It was all over. His style was wonderful in this. He didn't always win these things, but his style was superb. And he really was a commanding figure in this way. And his contribution to the development of the department, with which he was at times frustrated, at times disappointed, nevertheless was great. And I think some of the strength of the Harvard History Department came from his impelling insistence on seeing the best possible outcome. My other connection with him was in writing a textbook. Shortly after he got to Harvard, David decided that we should write a very superior textbook. Now you should understand that textbooks are really stupid. I mean, they are especially the ones that sell very well. And they're a chronicle of public affairs with a chapter or two tossed in on culture and intellectual history, and at the simplest possible level. And David, quite correctly, said that we can certainly do better than that. And he designed a textbook, which indeed was published in 1977, called The Great Republic. There were 6 of us. He and I were the senior guys on it. There were 6 of us who contributed to it. And the idea was the following. It would not be a stupid book, but it would raise the problems, the paradoxes that people actually faced at the time, and it would be analytical. It would try to probe into the problems as well as present the solutions that we know from the historical record. And it was a very lofty view with which all 6 of us agreed. And we undertook to do it. He scrutinized the entire huge manuscript. It's a big book. And he went over every contribution. I was more or less in charge of the early period. He was more or less in charge of the later period. But in fact, he went through the whole thing. And when one of our contributors, I may say, a very prominent historian, David felt the contribution was not really at the right level, by a process I can't now reconstruct, he got rid of him. And since each of us had a contract with the publisher, that was not easy. Nevertheless, the book came out, and what I remember most about this book, it was a reasonable success. Went through 4 editions, I believe. and then some remnants after that. But it did not sweep the textbook market. The American history textbook market is a huge market, and it's influential, and it's also lucrative. And we did not get terribly rich on this. The publishers, as publishers do, made a great study of why this was so. And since it was really quite a good book, and they came to the following conclusion. The book was being bought by the teachers, not by the students. The teachers were buying the book, and there are many more students than teachers. But the teachers were buying the book, and they were using it for their teaching, their presentations, and the kind of questions they would raise, and then, then they would assign some stupid book to the students to follow along. So while I have to say I think the book was a success, and I'm proud of having been involved in that book, which really was designed by David Donald, it did not quite do what he and we hoped that it would do. From these experiences in the history department and working with him so closely on this textbook, I came away with a feeling of great respect for his intelligence and his craft as a historian. He had developed the sophisticated, it's been commented on by our other speakers, with which I completely agree. He had not only this empathy, but the capacity to convey it wonderfully, and not sentimentally, and with no gush to it. It's clear, sharp kind of writing. And I came away with the greatest respect for him, for the integrity of his purpose as a scholar and as a teacher, and for his ability to stick with these projects of teaching and writing at the highest level. So I appreciate this moment to be able to pay that tribute to him, which I have thought about a great deal today, and now more than ever appreciate having been associated with him.
I'd like to thank all three speakers. I think that just absolutely encapsulated what made Professor Donald so special. Thank you so much. Now we would like to ask our honored guest, Aida Donald, to join us at the podium. On behalf of the Concord Free Public Library, we would like to bestow the 2009 Ruth Ratner Miller Award for Excellence in American History to David Herbert Donald.
I don't have a speech, and I'm not prepared, but I do want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank the family of Ruth Ratner Miller for the award. I want to thank our three speakers, all of whom I know. Bud mostly. You got it right, Bud. I appreciate what they said and the words about David's work and David as a person. As I think about his career in just maybe 2 sentences, David spent most of his years in the Midwest and in the North, and of course he grew up in the South. And he was able to combine, I think, the intense rigor and discipline and energy of Northerners with the storytelling ability of Southerners. And I think it's no problem that his favorite novelists were William Faulkner and Eudora Welty. He was an enlightened Southerner, as John says. And it showed up in his work. And he worked very hard, and he loved writing, and he loved his students. And I think all of you have captured him, and I want to thank you.
And now I'd just like to ask you to please join us for the reception, and also take a moment to look at the display from our special collections on Concord in the Civil War, which is near the Sudbury Road entrance. And thank you, and good night.